starting with the skeleton. So in this class, we will be both drawing from models in the class and also working on anatomical diagrams from a number of different sources. As we're making these diagrams, we're going to start literally from the inside out with the body. We're going to start with the skeleton and work through the muscles in different groups to understand their location, their function, all the unique qualities that give form to the body. So looking at the skeleton as a whole, before we start talking about its individual pieces, it's important to recognize that form follows function. So the shape of the individual bones, the shapes of the parts of the skeleton relate directly to what the function of that part of the body is. So I'd like to talk kind of top to bottom first about how the skeleton works. So we're looking at a pose here that's very naturalistic. This kind of interestingly in contrast to the way that the skeleton starts as a kind of symmetrical understanding. So right away we can see that although there's a kind of mere symmetry through the skeleton, the potential for movement and balance and imbalance is really built in to the joints and the relationships between bones. So you can see the hip bone tilting, the spine curving, the shoulders tilting, the head turning. All of these subtle movements through the joints of the body create a kind of dynamic equilibrium where the potential for movement is always there. We can also look at the shapes of the individual bones or the collections of bones and think about what those shapes are doing. Starting with the skull, so starting with the top of the skeleton, we can understand the skull both as a protective case for the brain and a point of entry and exit of information. So nerve signals coming from the brain through the spine, sensory input from the eyes, the nose, the mouth, all kind of going back directly into the brain, and senses from the body, nerves from the body, sending signals back up through the spinal column. So both as a form that protects the brain and also connects the brain to the rest of the body. Two functions of the skull. We can look at the spine. Move this light around so you can see it a little better. Look at the spine as a curving support structure for the trunk of the body. So the spine is never straight up and down. It's designed to be in this really beautiful double S curve and to connect and articulate with the bones of the rib cage and the pelvis in a very specific way. The shoulder girdle, bring the light back around, which I kind of imagine almost like shoulder pads sitting on top of the rib cage. The shoulder girdle includes the scapula, the humerus, the top bone of the arm, the upper bone of the arm, and the clavicle. The clavicle and the humerus connect to the scapula at this joint here called the acromion process. The scapula is actually free floating. There are muscles that attach to the spine and to the rib cage, but it can move in a number of really interesting ways. It can kind of slide up, it can slide back and around, always in conjunction with what's happening with the shoulder. The clavicle can move up and down, and the clavicles can move not symmetrically, so you can move one but not the other. So one shoulder blade can actually lift up, kind of like you can do a one-arm shrug. That allows for a really great freedom of movement in the upper body. And considering that we walk with our legs and then do all kinds of other things with our arms, it makes sense that this joint is very flexible but also sort of vulnerable. Looks quite different from the hip joint, which is much more stable. If you've ever dislocated a shoulder, what's happening there is that the ball of the humerus kind of pops out from that shallow cup of the scapula that holds it in place. So it's a very delicate joint, but the trade-off is that it's very mobile. Shine our light back in front again. The rib cage is a series of bones connected by cartilage to the scapula, that central bone there. Each part of the rib cage can move, so they can expand outward, they can turn side to side. You can see there's cartilage in the back as well connecting to the spine. This allows us to breathe, this allows us to twist back and forth, to bend forwards and backwards. It allows us to have forms kind of move around and move up into the rib cage actually when you're pregnant and you need more space there. So it's a very important and flexible part of the body. It's also protecting the vital organs, the heart and the lungs, while allowing for that flexibility. The pelvis, kind of by contrast, is a fixed set of bones. 3 different bones here that are fixed together, the sacrum and the 2 wings of the pelvis. And they support the weight of the trunk, of the torso, and at the same time provide a surface for connection for all of the muscles of the upper thigh and the hips. So all of that flat area allows for connections of muscles. And then the kind of bowl of the pelvis there supports all of the weight of your torso. The pelvis bone is one of the hardest ones to kind of visually understand because it's so embedded in the body. The femur, like the humerus, has a ball and socket joint and can move in a number of different ways. It can move left to right to a degree, forward and backwards. It can twist. While the bones of the lower leg, the tibia and the fibula, can only move in one direction. That's actually just like the ulna. Can only move in one direction, bone of that lower arm. The 2 bones here, though, allow the foot to twist back and forth just a little bit. Same thing with the bones of the lower arm. Having 2 bones there means that the wrist can turn over, and watch how that one bone spins, rotates across the other. That's the radius spinning over the ulna. So we're going to talk about all of these bones in detail, looking at anatomy diagrams from a number of different sources, kind of condensed into your anatomy sketchbook. So to talk for a minute about how artist anatomy books are organized and how we'll be using this resource, one of the resources I use often for my anatomy diagrams is Anatomy for the Artist by Gino Barksay. So I'm going to show you how this book is organized and then talk a little bit about how your anatomy sketchbook is going to be organized. I think of this as the big yellow book. So Gino Barksay starts with information about anatomical terms and positions, which we will review, and then begins with the skeleton, talking about the skeleton in full like we just did, breaking the skeleton down into individual sets of bones, so looking at the movements of the bones of the upper limb, anterior views, posterior views, lateral views, medial views, and then information about how these bones move and work together in the body. And then proceeds to look at the actual muscles that sit on top of those bones, following the same sequence. So anterior view, working through each of the muscles, a posterior view, a lateral side view, and a medial view. And also how the muscles kind of change direction or change their shape with movement through the body. He also includes this really wonderful section about balance, about movement, and then examples of really incredible student work, showing how his students have understood the forms of the body particularly the skeleton, within a kind of dynamic, active person figure. These are really fun to look at. Your sketchbook is going to follow a similar sequence. We're going to begin with information about anatomical terms. I'm going to talk about the individual parts of the skeleton, including beginning with the spine. We'll look at views of collections of bones or parts of bones. And then develop the muscles of the body on top of those forms. As we're doing this, we're going to be drawing from life each week. We're going to be drawing from master copies, and all of this information is going to kind of sync together or fit together to educate your eye and to allow you to understand and represent the body more effectively.